Welcome, everyone, to the Cognitive Science Show. This is episode 2 of Psyche-pathology and well-being. And if you don't know why the title's that way, that'll become clear as we're going through the series. I'm here again with my friends and collaborators, Gregg and Gary Hovhannissian. And this is episode 2. The link to episode 1 will be in the notes. And what we did last time, I primarily took the lead, and how the general format of this series, like other ones I've done with Gregg, is one person generally carries the role of proposing an argument or a theoretical framework, and the other two circle around it in dialogos, asking questions, adducing clarification, etc., drawing out the argument. And so we're trying to, as a method, integrate argumentation and dialogos. And Gregg and I have had, I think we would regard it as considerable success on this. And we're going forward with that format. So you'll see Gregg, for example, will take center stage today. Last time I took center stage and I presented some arguments problematizing the issue of psyche-pathology and well-being. I won't review, there's a big discussion there. I suggest if you haven't seen the first episode that you go back and look at it, but I problematized the whole thing. Why is it difficult to talk about the psyche-pathology, well-being? And I went through sort of several points, but now what I'm going to do is hand things off to Gregg and Gary. I'm going to ask each one of them to introduce themselves, and then Gregg will lead us into the second episode. So let's perhaps start with Gary in the introductions, and then Gregg, you can introduce yourself and just roll.
Fantastic.
Sounds great. Okay, so I'm Gary Hovhannissian. I'm a PhD candidate at Duquesne University in clinical psychology. I've got a background in philosophy and cognitive science. I've worked with John both as a student and as a collaborator, and I've known Gregg since 2015, where we met at an academic conference, and I've been in dialogue with these two giants since then. So really looking forward to bringing some of my own training and theoretical knowledge to bear on these conversations to see where they go. So
beautiful. Yeah, Gary, it's been a joy, and thanks, John. So yep, Gregg Henriques, professor of psychology at James Madison University, theoretical clinical psychologist, and pretty well known, I guess, in the cognitive science corner. And founder of UTAK, Unified Theory of Knowledge, which I'll be talking a little bit about today. So I'm super excited about today to kind of share with you guys to see if we can kind of grok two central concepts, okay? So my goal actually in these next two is to provide a framework that may be up to the task of addressing what John brilliantly problematized in the first episode. And so my hope is to try to put some outline puzzle pieces together that actually afford us intelligible coherence that is up to the task of delineating what we might mean by psyche-pathology and well-being. And then we can kind of go from there and then get into some of the other things that you guys talked about attachment, personality, centrality, recursive relevance realization, and then build off of that. So that's what my goal is today. I'll just say a little bit about UTAK. So what is that? Unified Theory of Knowledge. It's a meta psychological system that exists between the space of philosophy and psychology. And what it tries to do is coherently tie together a natural science worldview. It says there is a ontological worldview of natural science that has emerged, scientific psychology, and then bridge that to subjective experience and the social construction of knowledge, and do that with coherent intelligibility. It really situates itself, UTAK does, around three foundational problems, which I'm not going to delineate in great depth, but the first problem is very relevant today. It's a problem, well, all these problems are relevant today, but first problem is a problem of psychotherapy, okay? And Gary, as a doctoral training student, okay, you will know the problem of psychotherapy, and that is, what the hell do you do when you get in the clinic room? Okay, and a nutshell. And then the issue is, what are the ontological, epistemological, research, practice-based notions that actually ground your identity as a psychological doctor, okay? Put more basically, you have a person in front of you, you have enormous numbers of schools of thought that tell you different features of what kind of issue you should attend to, how you should think about the problem, what frames it, how do you enter that. My frame was there are a lot of really good mid-level perspectives. Behaviorism offers a really interesting thing. Humanistic, I certainly identify 5 major psychological perspectives of the behavioral tradition, the humanistic tradition. In fact, I argue that Carl Rogers, really good therapy begins with Carl Rogers, in my estimation, the psychoanalytic to psychodynamic tradition. And then you get the cognitive tradition, and those are big 4 traditions that afford individual level. And then you can jump up to a systems level, you get family systems. And then you can bookend that to the social systems and psychiatric view, okay? And of course, within there's a multiplicity of plural perspectives that aspectualize different features. And essentially, it's rich, but it's a jungle, okay? In the sense that, well, is it really the best you can do to simply see what you prefer based on your own sense and personality and struggles, and then pick from there and who your mentors were and be like, okay, I'm going to now just identify that way when somebody else is going to identify that way. And there's nothing that actually really then foundationally grounds that decision, okay? In the sense that it's a chaotic, fragmented pluralism or just a jungle. And the sense-making capacity with any kind of specificity is not good, okay?
Gregg, is it primarily, because I've heard therapists say this, and they say it almost as a point of pride, but I find it a critical thing to say. They say that their method is eclectic. And that strikes me as, that's problematic. Not
well, if you care about coherence, John, yes, eclectic is essentially the death knell of coherence.
Because there's no way, there's no way to compare even, right, within your own practices year to year. So how would you compare? How would you know if you're making a mistake? How would you track progress? Like if you're an eclectic, I just found that statement always, I would often hear it in a social setting, and then I'm usually useless in those settings anyways. So I would just nod politely while thinking into my mind, isn't that a problem? Like, totally. Why are you happy about that? Like, I wouldn't want to go to a doctor who was eclectic, right? Sometimes I use surgery. Sometimes I will get I'll rattle the beat. I'll do rattles and, chant and sometimes I'll pray and so no, I don't want that. Right. No, that's not what I want.
Right. So I'll just give it, we can contextualize that term, okay, and it has some value, if you know the history, but it also carries a significant limitation. So what I'll quickly then just delineate evolution of psychotherapy, and at least from where I sit, in 4 potential phases, meaning the last one's a potential. So the first is the single school approach, okay? So up to the 1970s, you basically have these fundamentalist factions, and you really don't have a choice, but they're so divergent. The languages are so different. They're anchored to so many different things in terms of training and everything else. And the gurus that you follow, you either follow Carl Rogers or the Freudian tradition or the behavioral tradition, okay? And then you get basically a fundamentalist attack zone, which itself, given the limitations of these systems, is not ideal, right? Okay, so you wouldn't want, or you could certainly then see, and I would even argue, that the evolution of the single schools in their diametric opposition to an eclectic view is not necessarily bad, okay? In the sense that you can then say, hey, all right, I see that these each have key insights and I want to try to draw from them. And I'll be open rather than force myself inside a box. I'll be open to sampling and have an eclectic attitude, in my estimation, is actually a proper evolution, okay? Right. But the eclectic is not a place from which one can construct any kind of coherent, intelligible framing for your identity. It is simply all of the things that you said then in relationship. Right. It essentially then is very vulnerable to embracing and being satisfied with a chaotic, fragmented, pluralistic knowledge system that can't be then held in any particular kind of standards of epistemology and clarity. So that's a big, okay. So then the field evolves, and in fact, I'm president right now, president of the Society for the Exploration of Psychotherapy Integration.
Right.
Okay? And psychotherapy integration takes this eclectic attitude and then adds or attempts to add academic intellectual refinement to what would be meaning about a systematic approach that can then ground the processes by which you form these interconnected notions that then allow you some grounding. Say, it's not like I just hodgepodge it. I'm systematic, and I have a particular framing and identity upon which I'm going to now approach this. Okay. The society I'm president of is called the Exploration of Psychotherapy Integration. That was as far as the pioneers wanted to go. Like, hey, it's a big deal that we're exploring this issue.
Right.
It's not the Society for Psychotherapy Integration. They have to add the exploration. Okay. And I'm actually part of a group of individuals that came along in 2010s mostly. In fact, we all got together and we were like, actually, the exploring is now out of time where we may be done. Meaning that there actually are opportunities to have found grounds to afford coherent integration and to build cumulatively off that coherent integration. Okay. So that actually there is systematic ways to place the single SUs together in a way that affords complementarity and coherence to give rise to a cumulative picture that can then do the job that is necessary, that's up to the task, to hand a psychological doctor the framing to walk into a clinic room and be aware of the holistic person in front of them, beware of the value dynamics, beware of the notions of psychopathology, well-being, and enter that system with a degree of sort of an identity and a skill task that's up to the task of actually doing this very, very difficult thing.
Right. And so in doing that, which is, I think, what needs to be done, I mean, then you are having to confront the problems we talked about last time.
100%. And certainly jump in at any time, Gary, but the problem of psychotherapy was that. And then I did this really weird thing, okay, that no one else has done. I then said, well, medicine is relatively well coherently organized, okay, Western medicine. You can critique the hell out of it, all sorts of, how to fly, blah, blah, blah. But if you look at its basic organizational structure, you have the biophysiological pathologies, breakdowns of particular organ systems, interventions that are done, manage those malfunctions, and ease suffering at that level. Where does that organized knowledge come from? Oh, there's a thing called human biology. Okay. The science of human biology, as humans, as organisms made up with genes and cells and organ systems that live in an evolutionary history. We have a clear ontology and a scientific organization at the base level of what we mean by human biology. Okay. So it's a basic scientific understanding of human biology that's up to the task of affording us clarity of an applied discipline that then engages in prescriptive, pun intended, prescriptions for how you ought to be to cure malfunctions and harm at this level. And so you get a correspondence between biological doctors, medical doctors, human biology, and the breakdown. And then so what I did was, well, fuck, if psychotherapy is, call it psychological doctoring, okay, then what we should then have is we should have the basic coherent organization of human psychology, okay, that should then afford us the capacity to then organize the various psychological systems in proper relation, and then at least provide the basic scientific ground upon which we then prescribe psychological health interventions. Okay, that's what should happen. At least that's the way my mind thought about it, coming from a sort of grounded in natural science perspective. And then I went and asked, what do we mean by human psychology that would afford us the basic, and now I would say metaphysical ontological framing of that topic? And that's when I discovered the problem of psychology. There isn't one. I mean, there's just nothing here. We don't know what we mean by the term psychology. We know what we mean by human biology. We don't know what we mean in the sense that there's, just with all the schools of thought around psychotherapy, they essentially borrow, well, at least some of them certainly borrow from the schools of thought inside psychology. And you get the same basic problem at the science level, in the sense that it's a multiplicity of different paradigms, okay? That's really just ends up, if you know its history, and I'm not going to get into it, but basically the schools of thought compete, none of them win, and then the system defaults to methodological unity. They become experimentalists in the application of the scientific method and commit to whatever the thing is ontologically. Well, what we do is we look through the epistemological lens of science, and then we're going to grab our identity through a methodological, epistemological science of behavior, what we see scientifically, mental processes which you'll never define, and voila, we're a science because we apply the methods of science. which is, of course, my whole critique, that methodological behavioralism organization. I mean, every science applies the methods of science. That's why it's in science. Why is the science of a particular kind? What do you mean by what's the ontological referent of psychology? So, and you talk then tackles the science of the problem of psychology fairly directly. And then I backed into, well, why was this such an unbelievable problem? And the final problem you talks about is the Enlightenment gap. And this is the argument basically that what happened with modern science, okay, and if philosophy in the 17th, whatever century, in the 18th century, et cetera, is that deep metaphysical philosophical problems emerged that never got resolved, that we can see as two broad features. One is the mind-matter relation, okay? It's uncrystallized in the mind-body problem or the hard problem of consciousness, okay? And then you have the kind of thing scientific knowledge gives relative to social and subjective knowledge, okay? And that's the modernist, which says, oh gosh, we can read transcendent realist arguments with reason and deduction that tells us truths beyond culture, versus the postmodern critique that says, no, you're always embedded and contextualized in a system of subjective or social justification, and you're always entangled in that. You can't transcend that, essentially, okay? So the Enlightenment gap is you can't solve mind-body and can't solve modern versus postmodern framings, and then you get the explosion in the modern state of a chaotic fragmented pluralism writ large, okay? If we come back, if that's the backdrop philosophically, then you come back to the problem of psychology and well, no shit, how could you have a science of whatever mind is or whatever that would afford clarity if the backdrop of the Enlightenment gap says matter mind is impossible, science subjective knowledge is impossible, you're obviously already going to be, no wonder you couldn't solve the problem of psychology if that's the conceptual backdrop. Okay. So
That was great, Greg. That was great.
Good. So that's what
I just on other series that Greg has done, Greg and I have done together, he goes through that history in more depth and detail. So I'll put some notes in the description of this video. So if you want to hear that argument, I think Greg summarized it brilliantly. But if you want to hear it more at length and more discussed by, for example, me or Zach Stein, right, then there's other places where I'll point you to with in the links. I just wanted to let the viewers know that, Greg.
Yep, good. And certainly, Gary, I know it's the first time we're dialoguing about it in this kind of depth, and certainly feel free to chime in, obviously. So let me just sort of then say so what UTOC says is that actually can achieve with the right backdrop, you can actually achieve coherence in these issues. That's possible. Ontological, metaphysical, and meta-theoretical coherence. Let me just say a little bit about what I mean by those terms. So what UTOC is a descriptive metaphysical system. Okay, basically what I mean is I'm going to be clarifying my concepts and categories up front. That's what I mean by descriptive metaphysics. And then I'm going to network them together to define the relationships between them. That's what I mean by a system. So it's a descriptive metaphysical system. And the strongest or most clearest articulation of the core of the descriptive metaphysical system is called the tree of knowledge. Okay. And this is a new map of big history that says, hey, we can track the evolution. Like there's a general shared understanding of evolution from Big Bang to present. That's the time axis. Okay. And some kind of complexity, although I prefer complexification, okay, from things like particles to atoms into cells into multicellular organisms into then finally people in society, okay? And there are a huge number of big picture systems, Wilson's Consilience, Sean Carroll's Big Picture, Eric Chiasson's Cosmic Evolution, and go on and on, Big History itself. These are all basically have these two axes, okay? And I would say this is just the common sense, weak, naturalistic, emergent view of evolution. And it does afford a particular ontological framing of reality, meaning it says, hey, our theories of reality seem to map this, and I'll use a Roy Bhaskar term, in a TINA sort of way. TINA stands for there is no real alternative, T-I-N-A. Give me another alternative, okay, that would actually account for all of our data that doesn't essentially have these basic time by complexification features. Now, what does this mean in terms of ultimate reality and consciousness and our knowledge? Okay, but you basically get this two-axis picture, should be part of the overall ontology from a natural science viewpoint. Okay. Tree of knowledge comes in and says, agrees with that completely. Okay, but it says it's missing something foundational when it comes to the nature of complexification. Okay, because what it says on the complexification axis is it says that there are these one kind of emergent jumps, threshold type jumps. Okay, you go from particles to atoms. Oh, that's a new levels of organization. And we can debate whether it's ontological, epistemological, but the atom, the particle to atom, atom to molecule, there's one, and then you molecule to cell, and the cell to multi-cell, and then up to humans. Okay. Tree of knowledge says no, it's 4 different cones. Okay, not just one cone of complexification, it's 4 different cones. Okay. So it's not just, oh, a cone of material complexity so that everything is material complexity. Basically what somebody like Sean Carroll and really E.O. Wilson and many of the big history essentially are, oh, it's just a component of complexification. Okay. Tree of knowledge says no, what actually happens is there are these aggregate pieces, okay, that do create emergent properties that have probably both epistemological and quite honestly, like object orientology stuff, ontological reality features, okay? But there's a radical different kind of shift that emerges when we make a jump from a molecule to a cell, okay? And the argument essentially is that the cell has an epistemic looping function, okay? Which I call originally the information processing, then it was information processing communication networking function that gives rise to the autopoietic, complex adaptive self-organizing features of cells that is simply absent in molecules, okay? And I would argue that you can network that stuff together through basically information processing communication, sort of an internal epistemic function. It's a knowing function, a cognitive function at a biological level, if you want to call it in the broadest terms. You know, if you use some of like Evan Thompson's conceptions, go right into that kind of basic structure. And the tree of knowledge says that actually what's happening then is that these epistemic organizations give rise to a new complex adaptive network that can be thought of as a totally new plane of existence that does have fundamentally new ontologic, as in epistemic processes that are different and non-existent and non-reducible to the plane beneath it, okay? If you buy that and then you say, well, what kinds of epistemic language systems emerge, the tree of knowledge says there are 3. There's this genetic cell one, okay? And then there's the nervous system animal one, and then there's the language person culture one, okay? So it's cell, gene cells, brains animals, and people language, basically, as then new emergent epistemic information processing systems that give rise to the ways in which complex adaptive systems can communicate with each other. And then that creates a whole other higher order narrative, okay? So to the extent that that is true, it basically then says, oh, we need to be able to identify these transition points between these different dimensions as central, okay? And the tree of knowledge says that we've missed 2 crucial, we are ambiguous as hell about 2 crucial joint points. Well, first it says the old mechanistic shit is like, we got to upgrade our matter and motion, both underneath it at energy information like quantum theory, and above it at life as complex adaptive systems. So, and that's basically happened in the 20th century, okay? It then says the similar jump has to happen at the animal Cambrian explosion. There is a sensory motor looping function that gives rise to mental cognition. If you want to use this, I'll say that's not redundant right now because I said biocognition down here. We can talk about the use of the term, but now we're at mental. And what is that? That's that sensory motor looping function between the nervous system. I got my dog right here, okay? This goes all the way down to crabs, but he's engaged in an animal mental relationship with me right now, okay? Complex active body, brain, behaving as a functional whole, which is organized internally, I will argue, by recursive relevance realization at the what would be the proper cognitive term for the stack, okay? And then it functions to operate with the environment to cultivate paths of behavioral investment, which from a Skinnerian perspective, you can say, okay, there's a selection process from the outside that we can map with a selection process on the inside. And that affords you a particular mapping of the mental evolutionary plane, okay? The animal mental plane of existence. That says there's a joint point there. And the argument basically from the unified theory is that's actually the bridge between biology and basic psychology, okay? Basic psychology, which is what we're going to argue at the mental process level. What do you mean by mental process? Well, some people do mean this neurocognitive functional system of a very, maybe a crab or whatever, pretty simple structure. And other people mean the Cartesian notions at the highest level. We talked last time, oh, my mind is totally shaped by my culture because my language frames the world in a particular way, and I believe in gender, okay, and that's what my mind is. Well, that's not what I'm meaning down here. We talked about the reference, the rainbow of referent last time. Well, that's a referent, okay? So the argument is that a whole basic psychology with the predominant ontological referent of animal mental behavior. And the tree of knowledge introduces a new term, capital M mind, to capture this dimension of evolution. And it corresponds very much to life, okay? And now basic psychology is the science of mind, capital M, which is the set of this animal mental behavior, which evolves at a different dimension of complexification in exactly the same way life does, okay? And if that is true, if that's valid, now you actually have a clear ontological referent for the base of psychology, animal mental evolution. And my dog walking away is a good example of the kind of behavioral patterns that I am interested in as a basic psychologist, okay? So that's one thing that UTalk says is the first thing we got to get is life to mind, okay? And mind is animal mental. The second line it draws is that my dog is not following this conversation. We can test him, okay? And the words that I am offering coming out through my face hole, okay, are being absorbed by the two of you in just a qualitatively different way than he would ever be able to absorb it, okay? He cannot participate on the person-culture plane of existence because he does not have access to a language acquisition device and whatever capacity for intersubjective relating that affords us the capacity to download shared narratives, normative systems, nomenological systems at the propositional network level and allow us to justify to each other what the hell we're doing and why, okay? So that's a whole nother kind of mental process. And it's got its own evolutionary history, the evolution of culture. I am a particular way because the socialized networks of justification of me being born in 1970 in Northern Virginia versus 5,000 years ago in Egypt or whatever, just a totally different network, okay? Similar hominid structure, radically different, socially constructed structure, okay? So now you get the two big domains of mental process, ontological domains, that the unified theory says you better separate if you're going to be talking about behaviors and mental processes. All right, there's the animal mental and culture person. One corresponds to basic psychology. The other is a totally different field, human psychology. Okay, and the human psychologist is concerned from a scientific perspective of mapping human mental behavior. All right, okay. So I've given you the scientific frame that says psychology at the science ontological level is two things. It's basic and human, all right? I argue that the field of psychology has got to be divided up into three different domains. Basic psychology, human, and then how I started, remember, with the problem of psychotherapy, which is I'm a medical doctor. I'm not about describing, well, a person comes into me, my task is not, give me the most general nomenclatic analytic description of this person that is justifiable through deductive reasoning. That is not what my task is as a psychological doctor, right? If you just did that and all you did was some sort of, not to be pejorative, kind of a quasi-autistic just reporting of analytically, this is what your behavior pattern should be a function of, it would be horrifying, right? Okay. Your task is to enter a unique individual context, a real, who's subjectively experiencing an enormous amount of distress, at least as a traditional psychotherapy relation, and figure out a way to reduce the dysfunction and distress and enhance a reversal, okay, toward more optimal functioning, more positive growth, more valued states of being. To the extent that you're able to do that, you're a good psychological doctor. So the goals of a psychological doctor are about moving stuff prescriptively. That's your goal, not analytically describing stuff descriptively. And because it has a fundamentally different goal and a different skill set and a different function, it's got a totally different metric that needs to organize its identity. All right, I'll pause there because now I needed that to structure, because I'll just then say two fundamental concepts that are at the epicenter. I mentioned animal mental behavior, human mental behavior. What's at the epicenter of professional psychology? Psyche and well-being. I'll pause there and see if that jives with folks. I went a little long on that. I'm sorry, but
That's fine, Greg. I'm keeping my mic off as much as possible right now, so that was actually good because they're doing renovations apparently above me without giving me any notice, which I'm kind of upset about. But nevertheless, it was fine for me that you were taking a lot of time because I'm hoping they'll end this particularly noisy patch. I wanted to ask maybe one thing, which is there's a similarity. So in the psychology of reasoning, and this goes back to Jonathan Barron, he distinguishes between three kinds of theories, sort of a descriptive explanatory theory, and then a normative theory, not in the statistical sense, but in the way philosophers use the word normative, which is, okay, here's a behavior. So here's how people are actually making inferences. And here's the explanation of why they do it. Here's a theory of how they should do it, which is your normative theory. And then a prescriptive theory is the theory of how do I move people from here, right, from the descriptive explanatory theory to the normative state. And so he makes a distinction between descriptive, explanatory, normative, and prescriptive. And so I'm wondering, does that help? Does that map on to what you're doing in any way? Because that makes sort of that taxonomy makes sort of an a priori sense to me. We have descriptive explanatory projects. We have normative projects in which we try to describe optimality or perfection or whatever, however we're giving normative standards. And then we have a prescriptive theory, which is a design theory for what kind of interventions will move people from this to this.
Love it. Yeah. And that's absolutely, let me just, because I want to be, move us along, because I'm really, that prescriptive idea shifts us very much inside the mindset of a psychological doctor. Okay. So that the task of the psychological doctor is to grab a hold of the proper descriptive explanatory normative relation. And indeed, I'll actually just grab that and I'll just say, okay, my formal descriptive explanatory good theory, they're going to have I'll just put it in folk psychological normative theory of the person in front of me. Okay. So I'll twist this around. This isn't exactly what he means, but let me just play with it a little bit, shift it slightly, and then say, hey, the person in front of me is going to have a folk psychological theory of being in the world. If I'm now in a psychological, I have my refined descriptive explanatory theory of human mental behavior in general. The intersection then is that I'm going to bring, if I'm a good psychological doctor, I'm going to bring that and interface with them. Okay. And then that interface then requires, my task is to afford that interface, participatory interface, in a way that sets a potential for us to leverage a prescription to a shared understanding that moves them toward an ought to be. Okay, so that's not exactly map, but if I just twist it slightly, it will map. Okay, in that regard. And that is what my task is. Psychological doctor, background understanding, wounded idiographic folk normative description, shared understanding to prescripted outcome. Okay, that's essentially the dynamic.
That's helpful. I wonder if I can bounce back on that a bit.
Sure.
Because I was seeing, I was sort of mapping it this way, but I think it resonates. I was saying, like, we ultimately want a descriptive explanatory theory of the psyche, and then we have a normative theory of well-being, because well-being is a normative theory, right? And then what we're trying to do is, like, not only I'm trying to pick up on what you said, not only bridge between those prescriptively, but bridge between those idiographically. Like I'm right, and you can see a parallel in biological medicine, right? In which people are trying to complement the you have this, do this and this, which is a nomological approach, with a narrative approach, which is, yes, but I need to involve the patient in their own healing. I need to involve the patient in their own healing, or they won't heal as well, right? And so you've got current attempts in human medicine to marry a nomological and a narrative approach together, and I think that is a good analogy for what you're talking about. Is that fair?
So, totally. And so now we can just add the other dimension, which I was going to add. So I'm really glad you put that. So as a psychological doctor, I'm required, and you'll see this in the way I map well-being, to be committed to a normative frame as a psychological doctor. Okay, I'll give you a quick example about what do you mean you're committed to a normative frame? Okay, somebody comes in and says, hey, Doc Henricus, I got a real problem here. I'm anxious. Okay, Okay. I'm trying to interact with people in a particular way and I get really anxious. I say, oh yeah, what's your problem? Now imagine these two paths. Hey, I like to go to parties and hang out with people and I feel really anxious and I then run home. Okay. My normative structure says, oh, that anxiety probably is dysfunctional. It'd be good for you to be able to interact. Okay. What if he said, actually, I really want to be a rapist? Okay. And my anxiety prevents me from actually effectively luring women into my car. And if you afford me the capacity to overcome that anxiety, I'll be more successful in my goal state. And obviously that should create a little in your stomach, right? You'd be like, oh my God, I would of course never want somebody to overcome their anxiety to afford them that kind of behavior. All right. Well, what is the structure that affords me the justification for totally supporting one and totally not supporting the other? Okay. A descriptive explanatory network? No. But a descriptive explanatory network that's embedded in a, for me, a normative framework that then is interacting with their subjective folk normative framework. And that's what so that's where I made the twist. And then I was going to come back and add that dimension.
Right. So that's great. That's a great example. So let's refer to it. I think that's very good. So what that says to me right away is that our normative theory of well-being is not simply sort of efficient functioning or something like that, because we're not enabling we're not allowed, we don't take a purely utilitarian in the mechanical sense, not in the ethical sense, attitude towards this person. It's like, well, they want to go to goal X. My job is to get them to goal X, right? And to sort of lubricate the psychological machinery so they can get, that's an insufficient account of well-being. That's what that example immediately says to me.
Exactly. And that therefore, and this is one of the great problems of the field, is that actually then you have a professional identification that actually requires you to commit to some kind of normative field, okay? But what justifies that? What normative field are you actually going to now, how do you ground a particular justificatory framework on a normative field that relates to both values and functioning in any way that's coherent, especially when you interact with the descriptive explanatory problems that we were talking about? You can't even get the ground of what you're talking about clear. And now you have to get the ground of what you're talking about also anchored to some kind of normative by virtue of the fact that your task is to move people in certain value directions. So you're a prescriptive system. You can't do that with just descriptive explanatory stuff is completely inert to tell you which way you want to move a system.
So one more thing then, and I really hope Gary will say something soon, which is, so this leads, and notice I had to do something a few minutes ago. This leads to the normative equivocation in psychology, where we go from the original meaning in philosophy, normative meaning, a theory of how you ought to behave, what should be the case, right, to normative means, oh, on a Gaussian distribution, what is the most prevalent tendency? And that's what we mean by normative. And so what we do is, oh, and we just, those are somehow equivalent, which is normative means a sort of statistically normal. And that's the standard that we're holding ourselves to. And then how do we measure statistical normality? Well, how well people participate in, post-industrial capitalism. And leaving aside the possibility that, like we talked last time, that this might be a very, decadent, dysfunctional social organization, and fitting into it well may not be a marker by some other normative theory. But this my whole career, every third lecture, I have to say, I'm using normative the way I think it should be used. Notice the pun, right? And not just mean the statistical mean. I don't mean normal by normative. I mean excellent by normative. I don't mean normal. I mean excellent. And why normal becomes excellent is a big, big problem. And so I think the normative equivocation is something that we need to start, we have to explicitly call out and say, well, notice that Gregg is not it, where I don't think he is. I don't think he's just defaulting. What would the average person do in this circumstance, right? I don't think that's what Gregg is doing.
That's definitely not what I'm after.
Yeah, so the thing is, what is Gregg doing? And presumably that model, I mean, Gregg is, and this is a compliment, Gregg is an Aristotelian. Perhaps a Neoplatonist, but I'm not quite sure if I.
He's
I've
pulling
pondered-
me. You're pulling me, John. You know? Certainly
Namely-
blending half.
So, but Gregg's model would be something like this kind of standard Aristotelian argument. Good is good for X. And what's the X and good for X for our normative theories in the way I'm using it? Good for human well-being, right? That's the normative standard. And part of the argument is it is not good for well-being for human beings to behave immorally, right? That's a standard Aristotelian argument about virtue. And so I'm just trying to say how your normative theory and your theory of well-being are intimately and deeply connected. So if Gregg is right and psychology has no good coherent theory of well-being, it can't possibly provide a justification for any normative structure. And it hides behind the normative equivocation to paper over the fact that it can't actually justify the normative theory that it must rely on. That's how I would put it.
Totally.
Does that land for you, Gregg?
Oh, it lands brilliantly. One thing I'll say is if it hasn't been clear, the extent to which the basic animal mental psychology as a task and the human psychology scientists as a task are committing to certain normative implications and all of that is a very interesting one. Okay. And whether they have zero, which I don't think, or at least have one dimension, and maybe the basic has one kind and the human has another. That's actually what I believe. Okay. But what I'll still say is there's a whole nother layer of normative commitment to the psychological doctor. Okay. So when the psychological doctor is given the task, like your function of being in the world is to make prescriptive change, you are then committing yourself to not only operating in the backdrop of a normative structure, like I want to be an ethical scientist, but you are actually saying every action that I'm engaged in here is designed to orient toward a valued state of being. That's why I'm here. And so it's entirely clouded or informed by. And then what happens is exactly right. They'll equivocate on normative and normal distribution. Now, often they'll equivocate on normative as the subjective experience of being. Oh, you tell me that this is right. That's right. Okay. And, that's what they'll do too, because they're trying to make sure we're not oppressing from who am I to say with a power-based structure. So the emphasis is there on power-based issues. So they grant enormous normative legitimacy to the subject, which believe me, I'm not denying, but that's a whole nother, like, that's why I use the rapist example. It's like, hey, that's good for me. It's like, no, that is no way are we going to subscribe to a particular normative structure effectively as psychological doctors if that's going to be the simple ground that we're going to try to do it. It's just completely unworkable that way.
So maybe this is an appropriate moment for me to jump in. Actually, I've been really thinking about the story you offered, Gregg, the way it all started for you with the problem of psychotherapy, which then led you into the problem of psychology, which then led you to explore and articulate the enlightenment gap and everything that it entailed. I guess I'm wondering if you could flesh out a little bit the connection between the enlightenment gap and the problem of normativity as we're talking about it, because right now what seems to be center stage is the question of what is normativity in the axiological sense to begin with.
Totally.
How can we define it? Where can we locate it? Where is it? Where is it not? And the sense that I've gotten so far is that if we sort of follow along the story that you told us, right? The enlightenment gap and how it became deeply problematic in the ways that it sort of messed us up or led us astray, let's say epistemologically and methodologically, with respect to studying the mind as a part of nature rather than as a part from nature. How exactly did the enlightenment gap make it difficult to stay in touch with or to define or to articulate normativity as such? Could we spend a little time on that?
Sure.
Just connecting
Absolutely.
those bits.
Right.
I just want to make a bit of a joke here. I have this video series that takes like 50 hours to tackle that problem.
Clearly,
right?
I know.
So
clearly, right. Obviously, right. There's a thing called a meaning crisis. If we can axiologically ground our experience in meaning and proper recursive relevance realization, we'd be able to address that problem and launch us into another enlightenment. Right? So yeah, the bottom line is that there's a fundamental failure of a synthetic philosophy around the Enlightenment. And we're epistemologically captured by physics, matter, and motion in a particular kind of way. That's one way of saying it. In other words, like, oh my God, the knowledge systems that we grant with Newton and the mathematical mapping of matter and motion and the power of that, okay? This is a Ken Wilber argument. The power of that then creates an imbalance in our philosophical grounding, okay? We can now see that we have deductive analytic logic in a particular way that stands up to epistemological rigor and affords a kind of justification about gravity or whatever we want to say. And our axiological standing is I think in comparison felt weakened deeply. Okay, like and the institutions begin to emerge to become much more pragmatic, instrumental, and grounded in descriptive explanatory knowledge. And then the axiological stuff of value, you know, it's like, well, whatever. Okay, like so that now, I mean, it used to be that, you know, character education, Bildung kinds of things in Northern Europe and whatnot. But it's like, okay, our goal is to teach you how to be a good person. Okay, well, now we lost that. I mean, these things got obliterated in many ways. And there are lots of different reasons. I would certainly say that my diagnosis of the Enlightenment gap focuses on a couple elements: the nature of knowledge, what science is, and subjective social knowledge. You can place axiological or value-based or normative confusions very clearly in relationship to that as part of the fuzz, okay? And the other thing I'll say is that my beginning in psychotherapy, okay, and my deep concern about humanistic being, okay, situated myself to be actually axiologically grounded prior really to my analytic explorations. What do I mean by that?
Yeah.
You know, it's like I am at one point I was like, Jesus, if the unified theory was true, but disastrous in the way it impacted people, I would shut the hell up. Okay, I'll throw it in the trash can. In other words, there are certain kinds of axiological commitments that intersect with my epistemic truth commitments. Okay, and ultimately, I then ground the unified theory in an axiological set of commitments. Okay. In fact, I have an ultimate justification, which is B, that which enhances dignity and well-being with integrity. Okay. So what that does is it creates a particular, and indeed, this is my normative problem as a psychological doctor. What are the backdrop value structures, axiological commitments that will afford me the capacity to be in this world and feel value-based normatively in the philosophical sense, justified, that I'm optimally organized. And in an Aristotelian sense, those three actually I see in sort of a pyramidal sense. I like a eudaimonic ultimate endpoint, which serves as a value-based lodestar with regards to reflects back to my imaginal double, divine double, and asks me questions about whether or not I am being in the world actually relative to how I might be ideally in relationship to value considerations in the short and long term. So, and I believe that we have to have philosophical systems that engender those kinds of considerations.
Gary, could I respond to your question too? To just complement what Gregg said?
This is amazing,
So for me, the pivotal figure of the Enlightenment, the guy who wrote the essay, What is Enlightenment, is Kant. And Kant represents the way its particular history unfolded, the late Middle Ages. So, right, and the rise of nominalism and the flattening of the ontology with Scotus and Occam and the pure nature philosophers, etc. Again, more in detail in Awakening from the Meaning Crisis. But the point I want to make is, and this is a point that Habermas makes too. What happened is, we got the idea of the autonomy of reason, and what that did was that it broke a structure apart. We used to have the three transcendentals, the true, the good, and the beautiful, and they were thought to be completely interpenetrating, interdefining, interreliant, interaffordant, and that they were transcendentals because they applied to being per se, not to anything. And what that meant was there was an inherent normative structure to being. And then what you did was you figured out what kind of being you were, and then how those transcendentals became instantiated in what it is to be a human being, or what is it to be an angelic being, or what is it to be a horse being, et cetera, et cetera. And so with Kant and the nominalism and the autonomy of reason, the transcendentals break apart, and you have these autonomous normative zones. You have the true and the good and the beautiful, and they're all autonomous from each other, which initially was thought to be very liberating, and it is in some sense. But what it meant is all the interconnections between them broke down, right? So there's no relation between being true and being good and being beautiful. And you have Kant's 3 critiques, right? And he doesn't write the 4th critique, which is, how do the 3 critiques go together? How does the critique of pure reason, of practical judgment, right, et cetera, right? So he gives us ethics, and he gives us epistemology, and he gives us aesthetics, but no, in the Kantian framework, and this is Habermas's point, they can't possibly integrate, right? Now, what we've come to see, I would say, and the postmodern critique has done a lot of this, but also phenomenology has done a lot of work actually going on right now, is that the autonomy of those has been completely undermined. We know, as Gregg said, we no longer think that reason is completely autonomous and can sort of float transcendentally above everything and look, so we are in a place where officially science grew up within that, right? That those 3 autonomous and incommensurable spheres of normativity. What's happening right now is the real possibility of interconnecting them together, and interconnecting them with a rich model of being. I see that's what Gregg is trying to do, by the way. A rich, enriched model of being, an enriched account of how the transcendentals do interpenetrate and rely on each other. I think my work on relevance realization is about exactly that, by the way.
I agree.
And then how that plugs into a richer model of being. So I think that's what the Enlightenment basically fragments normativity, leaves it, use Gregg's word, unsynthesized, and also, like, leaves it disconnected from an account of being, because being was thought to just be becomes just an empty term, right? It doesn't stand for anything. So that's how I would answer that as quickly as possible.
Yeah, so now I'll just then synthesize that. So B, that which enhances dignity and well-being with integrity, was my backdrop. Now that connects to the 3 transcendentals. And in fact, I'll just share my screen real fast. John, if you could let me share my screen just for a second. And I'm going to show you just a picture of the seed. So in the garden, there's all these symbolism, all right? And the seed underneath the tree is part of the garden. And so the thing called a seed is right here, okay? And there are 3 core symbols here. There's this thing, which I'm not going to talk about, and there's this thing. And then there's this, which is a mitochondria. What it symbolizes is a mitochondrial energy production system, okay? And the big W is wisdom, okay? And then when I say B, notice the B, which now is going to pull together dignity, well-being, integrity. That's the DWBI. That's what that means. And the D, I argue, aligns with aesthetics, because actually dignity fundamentally is about valuing, and it's about elevating value in a particular way. Well-being aligns with goodness. That's what the G stands for. And integrity aligns with truth, okay? So in relation, and ultimately then the wisdom is the eudaimonic endpoint that is synthesizing the transcendentals, of which I then interpret through dignity, well-being, and integrity, but argue that that's one kind of pluralistic view. That's a coherent, integrated pluralism. I'm seeing the transcendentals. Here's how I'm aspectualizing them through my particular journey as a psychotherapist, into a psychological theorist, into a particular kind of human on the planet at this time. There'll be lots of different ways in which you might do that. But my point basically is there is a tight-knit connection here between, and by the way, well-being, actually then, what we're trying to get to here, the concept of that and what we're trying to map in relation then connects. So we're trying to map it descriptively, but it's also then embedded in a fundamental normative framework that grounds the entire beingness of, there are bees in the garden. The bees in the garden express the bees of Sophia and the bees of phronesis, which express the particular, how do we know about wisdom and how do we embody wisdom in particular ways?
Yeah, I want to reply to that too, because I think that's great. So the term that I think points most to the longing for the resynthesis of the three transcendentals is meaning. Because you need meaning for truth, you need meaning for goodness, you need meaning for beauty, and beauty is a particular way in which things are meaningful. Goodness is a particular way in which things are meaningful. Truthfulness is a particular way. And the, you know, the collapse of the value fact distinction. And what
You
I
can
would
turn
say,
that W upside down, John, and then it becomes an M, and then it's meaning.
yes. And so Gary, something that I think you would resonate with is that the work of Merleau-Ponty on this and embodiment and all the work in 4E cognitive science about meaning and how it is actually, right, what we do not find these things autonomously separated and incommensurable within our meaningfully structured experience. We find the true, the good, and the beautiful completely, deeply interpenetrating. Many people are acknowledging at least the phenomenological perspicaciousness of the ancient view. Well, yes, in our phenomenology, they are deeply interpenetrated, but then they'll sort of cough, but enlightenment, but it's like, wait. And all of your theories, this is Merleau-Ponty's point, they ultimately all ground down in your phenomenologically meaningfully structured experience. Your theory can't get to the place where it says, oh, and by the way, all that down there, that interpenetration of the true, the good, and the beautiful, that's all an illusion, because everything you built from it and everything is grounded in it. That's part of the deeper critique. And I thought if I connected it directly to phenomenology, you can see the point that I'm trying to make. The way our experience is meaningful is not a purely epistemic, or I would say propositional thing. It's not a purely aesthetic thing. It's not a purely moral thing. It is a chiasm of all of them. That's one of the great arguments made by Merleau-Ponty.
Could I extend that a little bit actually and make 2 points there? One of the points is that I guess when we're talking about developing descriptive explanatory theories of whatever it is that we're trying to talk about, there's a methodological point here about what it is that we even can mean by description. And one of the great contributions in my understanding of the phenomenologists is precisely in their definition of description. What's meant by description. So let me give you an example, and maybe the audience will enjoy this as well. Let's say a friend comes to you and tells you that they saw a ghost the night before at a graveyard. You look at them and obviously, or most likely, let's just assume here, you'll, whatever they said to you, whatever they shared with you it'll be at odds with your ontological and epistemological commitments. That ghosts are supernatural entities, and as a good old-fashioned scientist, naturalistically minded person, you don't believe in such things. It doesn't quite fit into the naturalistic worldview. Or maybe you're not even a scientist. Maybe you're just, a layperson who doesn't really believe in things that he doesn't see. And so it even comes at odds with your common sense assumptions. So from those two perspectives, right, the common sense attitude, let's say, or the naturalistic attitude, whatever your friend said doesn't really make sense, and therefore there's hardly any real meaning to be found in what they're saying. However, this is what the phenomenologists would say, that there's a different kind of attitude you could adopt with respect to what the friend is saying. You could take your ontological, metaphysical, epistemological assumptions and you can suspend them temporarily. You could bracket them. And then you could try to see what it might be like to be having the type of experience, right? Regardless of its ontological and epistemic validities of encountering a ghost. And then very quickly you will realize that there is a lot of meaning to be found there. To encounter a ghost is to be petrified, right? It's to be encountering something that leaves you in fear, in fright. You imagine an elevated heart rate immediately, right? Fingertips and palms getting sweaty, and your body freezing, your lungs, right, stopping, and you wanting to run away. There's a lot of meaning there to be found, right? That has much more to do with your manner of relationship to the world or some worldly aspects that can't be captured or even accessed if the attitude that you're inhabiting to begin with, and exclusively so, is that the natural scientific attitude. And so what the phenomenologists meant by description is look at experience as it shows up while suspending your ontological and epistemic assumptions and validities, right? Forgetting about the question of whether or not it's really true what's happening, or whether or not what you're seeing really exists, and just see what it says about your manner of relationship to the world. And then you get access to all sorts of different meanings that you otherwise didn't. And if you do that, this is the last point I wanted to make about normativity, to bring it back to that. If you describe experience in the phenomenological sense as it shows up, while suspending or bracketing your scientific prejudices, let's say, then what you come to also very quickly realize is that normativity is not the thing to be inferred. It's the ground from which you infer even things like objective truth.
Nice.
So then there really is, the problem of normativity gets redefined if you take that turn, because you're no longer trying to explain it.
Totally.
From an objective, but anyway, yeah, I'll stop there. Yeah.
Well, that's
I wonder
a great
what you think.
example. That's a great example. I mean, you know, you get the discovery of the category of the numinous, and then what you might do is you might say, well, maybe I need to make space in my ontology. It doesn't mean I don't just say, oh, there's ghosts, but I might need to make room in my ontology for the numinous, that maybe there are genuinely mysterious aspects of existence that supersede my capacities for conception or experience, and that nevertheless I can somehow enter into a relationship with them, and then they can have deeply transformative effects on me.
Yep.
And so what you get is what I call a reciprocal reconstruction rather than a simple reduction. You move out of the naturalism, you go into the phenomenological, you enrich the grounding meaning and normativity, and meaning is a normative and descriptive term at the same time. So is rational, by the way, right? And then you reciprocally reconstruct your ontology in order not necessarily to agree, because that's not what this is about, but in order to enter into right relationship with the phenomenology that has been disclosed by a I-thou relationship to the other person. And so that's why I keep talking about reciprocal reconstruction rather than reduction. That's exactly what I mean you do.
So much richness here. And so I'm going to make a couple of comments and then build off of them. So one thing that I try to frame UTalk as is an endo-naturalistic approach. So let me drop into science real fast, and then I'm going to drop into an onto-epistemological set of commitments. And remember, when I started with big history, it's an endo-natural approach that gets the map of big history right. So I'm going to take the physics, biology, science, ontology, epistemology on its own terms, say they don't get it right, fix it so that we can get to us as humans in the world with a proper realization of, say, complexification emergence, not as just a single threshold thing, but as thresholds within a dimension, and then jumping between dimensions and delineating these complexity building feedback loops called joint points. And if you don't have that, you're going to get a bad natural science. And they're bad because they don't understand metaphysics and ontology really well. And so they just throw labels on shit, and then we get confused because of the matter. So there's that. And UTalk then endo-naturally then fixes that. It's agnostic in terms of its ultimate claims. It's not foundationalist in a ontically foundationalist. So I don't know what the hell's going on in the world. I know what science tells me. That's pretty, and I'll drop my science hat on and I'll make certain claims in ghosts when I'm in that particular frame of reference. Yep, I know. I'm going to make certain ontological commitments, but I'm agnostic. And so is there an exo-natural frame? Hey, I'm agnostic about that. But now let me bring it back to the clinic room. Okay. Remember I said all good therapy for me begins with Rogers. What does Rogers begin with? Unlike the behaviorists and unlike the psychoanalysts, Rogers begins with phenomenology. Rogers begins what I'm going to call the psyche here, okay, which is the unique ideographic experiential meaning-making system of that particular person in the world. So the psyche for me then refers to the unique, particular epistemic organizing, observing function. Okay? And my task I mean, could you imagine a therapist that would be like, oh my God, I was out there with my friends, we saw this light, I'm sure it was a ghost, I was blah, blah, blah. Actually, the science is pretty clear. You obviously have just misconstrued completely your experiences. And let me tell you analytically what's going on. You would be, I mean, if I were supervising somebody that did that, immediately it would be, oh my God, you don't know what you're doing as a psychologist. What am I doing? I am entering the phenomenology of being across the psychic functions of core organismic valuing process, which is the epistemic function of the individual at its ground, or from way of framing it for humanistic, and then understanding the systems justifying to me and worried about its public or social self and the contingencies of judgment and the organization of that from a humanistic perspective is absolutely central. So therapeutically, the foundational task is not those kinds of concerns, but fundamentally to enter into the phenomenology of the other. You have to do that to do good therapy. So that in terms of the whole process by which we absolutely need different kinds of onto-epistemological frames for different kinds of tasks, and the task of the psychotherapist, okay, to me, the task of the psychotherapist is actually to relate to the psyche. The scientist can't even see the psyche. The scientist sees human mental behavior, okay? So the one way to frame it. The scientist sees human mental behavior and then it's like, well, whatever about that. That's tricky because the language game limitations, epistemological limitations of the third person modern empirical natural science enterprise is almost by definition blind to the unique idiographic qualitative experience of being from the first person. That's essentially, they get rid of primary, secondary, get rid of secondary, whatever, okay? To get rid of it too far, look at what Watson did. That's a talk about twisted, but it is tricky to bring it back in, okay? What I'm arguing is that actually the scientific language game commits you to basic animal mental behavior, which you can then study as fundamental behavioral investments. You can understand the neurocognitive functional system as a recursive relevance realization and the environment as selecting in a Skinnerian sort of way. And you can yoke those together with the concept of mental behavior. It's an inside outside hierarchically arranged stack of selection, variation, and retention, okay, that affords the capacity of building behavioral repertoires. You have to ignore. Yeah, go ahead.
Could I clarify? It's a clarification question. It sounds like, at least from the 4E cogSci literature, this sounds akin to what neurophenomenology tries to do. It tries to dialogue, right, the third person and first person perspectives together and to converge, right, somewhere in the middle from two opposing angles almost. And for the phenomenologists, that nexus point is embodiment. It's embodiment that presents itself, right, as phenomenon on the one hand, as an objective physiological phenomenon, while on the other hand, as a subjectively lived phenomenon. And I guess
that's that's the main argument.
Yeah, totally.
We are bodies among bodies, but we are also a lived body that is me. And those that's Evan's the body problem. Right. That's the issue. But I just wanted to say, for me, a place where I'm trying to do exactly what Gary just said, and Greg and I have been in ongoing discussion about this, is the whole idea of relevance realization. There's like within the project of being a mechanistically functioning intelligent being, you have to do relevance realization. But relevance realization generates qualia of experience that I think provide a good account of what meaning in life is. And therefore it helps to bridge between the mechanistic and the existential, I think, in a coherent fashion. And 100%. Gary and I have taken that up too in the paper we've published. And so I'm not saying this is the only theory, but I'm saying it's an example, and relevance realization is deeply dependent on autopoiesis, on embodiment, in order to perform its explanatory roles. That's epistemically and ontologically in order to function the way it does. So, and that's what, and when notice, you never pursue the truth. You pursue the relevant truth. There is no place, even in the guts of your science, where you are, I am just in relationship to the truth. I'm not saying truth and relevance are identical. I think that's a mistake that James made in pragmatism, because we use the two to correct each other. but they're interpenetrating and they're interdependent. And so for me, that's exactly I'm trying to say I'm trying to say this is a specific instance of a theory that's generated in exactly the way Gary is talking about. That's exactly how, and I'm trying to do that. And Gregg is constantly helping me to try to do it. I'm constantly trying to bridge between the phenomenological and the naturalistic, and do that reciprocal reconstruction. Relevance realization theory is an example of exactly that. It's like, no, this is your functionality as an information processor, and this is your sense of connectedness to the world that gives you meaning in life. And they are just two sides of the same thing.
And what happened to me, just on a parallel world, is because I situated myself in the problem of psychotherapy, both as a therapist and humanistically relating to a phenomenological psyche in front of me in the unique idiographic real. The entire project was to look out at science and ask whether or not there's a framework that's up to the task, to do justice to this given. This is a given that this is real. If this isn't real, nothing is.
Yeah.
This is more real than science, because this is the embodiment of being itself in relation. My epistemic ontic is awareness itself, and it will always have to be part of whatever ontological structure. The fundamental question, though, is can natural science afford us, in its own language game, a system of understanding that's actually up to the task and this is what John does. I mean, John, then, me, behavioral investment theory, the influence matrix, and justification systems afford a meta-theoretical structure that feels up to the task. I can see myself as an investing agent trying to influence my relational value around competition, cooperation, and then I'm a justifying human being that learned to legitimize. Those constructs do justice to me from a descriptive causal explanatory network. When you film this and you record it and you say, what's Gregg doing? Well, he's investing, he's influencing, and he's justifying. I can use that. And then I can use that to track my psyche. My psyche is much more than that from its own embodiment, but we have science in proper relation. And recursive relevance realization, when I found that tightened the grip, the neurophenomenological grip, with a level of depth and precision. Well, that's why I love John. Because I was like, oh my God, I can now take all that and stitch it together with a level of precision that now brings those things as two sides of a coin, together in a way that is just absolutely brilliant and beautiful.
I liked the noise, Gregg. That was wonderful.
I'm stitching recursive relevance realization across the hierarchy in relation to you guys, and then finding coherence and intelligibility, John.
Thank you, Gregg. Gary, I interrupted you, but I wanted to put that in as a specific example of exactly the neurophenomenological approach.
And I anticipate that we'll get there, right, into relevance realization later on in the series. And the only part that I was wanting to sort of extend that into was that the reason why this phenomenological solution even came up as a solution was in response to a different kind of problem. And I'm not sure how you see that fit in the current discussion. And I just want to share it and see what you think. But the way Husserl talks about it, and Merleau-Ponty takes it up as well. And actually, Jaak Panksepp also talks about it in the introduction of his book, Affective Neuroscience. It's right over there in the corner.
I know that book well.
So you're familiar with the problematic then, that there's this paradox where he and Evan Thompson talks about this. This is like this. Sorry, not just Thompson, but also Varela, Thompson, and Roche in the original publication.
The embodied mind.
Where here I am, I awaken to a world that seems to be already there prior to my being aware of it. And yet, every attempt to describe or understand the world necessarily and eventually leads back to my own self as observer. There's a sense in which I'm simultaneously part of the world. I emerge from the world. If we take the third personal perspective, like the big history point of view, right, that we were talking about. While at the same time, the world as I experience it, I constitute, right? I bring forth through my manners of being in it that are culturally mediated, et cetera, et cetera. But nevertheless, there's a kind of enactment or constitution taking place. And so what comes first, the chicken or the egg, the world or the self?
Totally.
And so I
But
suppose the way the
Heidegger,
Mhm.
I'm Merleau-Ponty and Heidegger. The answer is you're looking in the wrong place if you're looking at the self and the world. You have to look for what real relation, what grounds the possibility of a relationship between the self and the world. Being. What the self and the world share are being, and we are a particular kind of self in which our being is in question to us, and that gives us a particular access, right? And then Merleau-Ponty takes that and says, okay, but what's the locus of that? And he calls it the dehiscence of the body, right? That the body we live, that the body is both because I'm a body, there is no mystery in how I can know bodies. That gives me access to the bodies in the world, but I am also, right, that's whenever I'm touching, I'm being touched, right? I'm also, right, I'm also making meaning for me out of that encounter. And so for me, right, I don't think that Husserl solved that problem, but I think Merleau-Ponty and Heidegger did. And for me, that's exactly the transjectivity that I keep talking about, that what we have to put into ontology, not only the subjective and the objective, but being and body, which are both transjective entities and the grounding entities for all, both self and world, right, in sense, emerge out of being, and subjective and objective experience emerge out of the body. Now, getting the relationship between the body and being right, that's Gregg's work, right?
Exactly. And so I know we'll wrap up here, and we did not, we may have to get another episode, guys. This was great, but I don't know that I answered psyche and well-being, but I'll say this, and we can sort of jump off this. So in UTalk gives, you can learn the UTalk language. It's tree, coin, and garden, okay? The tree of knowledge, that's our new map of big history. We're going to take the natural science view of behavior and then contextualize individuals as epistemic knowers inside that behavior from a third person nomethetic generalizable view. Okay, that's, and the tree of knowledge then grants us. There's a thing called the coin. Okay, the coin is your human identity function in the world, i.e. your psyche. Okay, and it represents the architecture of each of our embodiment in an identification process as an observer embedded participatory perspectively in the world, phenomenologically. That's your core, and it's idiographic psychic. And the relationship then between a natural science behavioral third person generalizable and the idiographic personal is framed by tree and coin. And then ultimately an axiological collective structure that's grounded in where we ought to be is then framed by the garden. Okay. And so the task, I think, of all of these effectively structured Enlightenment 2.0 or whatever new axial age frames is going to come back and afford certain kinds of resolutions to the Enlightenment gap that stitch together the fracture that Kant engendered. And ultimately, that's what we're trying to do, I think, fundamentally here. When we get to psyche and well-being, quickly in the next one, then I'll jump to mental disorder if we have time or whatever, we'll figure out their structure. This is a great, for me, I'm really glad we got into a lot of backdrop because it sets up what I think it will become a pretty clear argument when we get to behavior, psyche, what well-being is, and then mental illness and the structure of that, that we might be able to, work in a much richer way than is currently being worked by any systems.
Yeah, and I one final thing in response to Gary, and then I want to hear what Gary wants to say. I'm sorry, Gregg just said a bunch of really cool stuff, but I'm trying to just stick to this one point because we're running out of time. The self-world, the chicken and egg problem, we know that the standard answers, right? The self is first, idealism in some fashion, right? The world is first, physicalism in some fashion. They're both first, dualism. They're all bankrupt, to my mind. And that's where I think Husserl gets that right. You see that in The Crisis. You see that in Merleau-Ponty. He keeps rejecting both of them. He rejects all three of those. All three, not both. He keeps rejecting all three of them consistently. Same thing with Heidegger. And that's, I think, that's exactly the game our ontology has to play. Now, I'm not claiming to have fully resolved problem you've posed, Gary. I think that would be pretentious. I don't think Gregg's doing that either. But what I'm saying is, I know that I built the theory of relevance realization within that frame, within that language game of, this isn't going to lead to idealism. It's not going to lead to, it's not going to at least go for reductive physicalism, whatever that's supposed to mean. And it's definitely not going to be dualistic. That's what, right? And for me, relevance realization requires an additional ontological dimension of commitment, which is the transjective as, right, the grounding relation and affording ground of subjectivity and objectivity.
Beautiful.
And I do think that object-oriented ontology is trying to say there's transjectivity between things, not only between people and things. And I think that was its crystalline insight. I think there's something deeply right about that.
That sounds very intriguing. I don't know what that means. I want to know what that means. So let's talk about it at some point.
Yeah. Yeah, I know we got to bring ourselves to a wrap.
Yeah.
I think you have a heart. So what I'll say, I'm going to go a little farther than you, John. I think that we're actually, for me at least, okay,
Yeah.
I think that well, when I say unified, I basically think that they're the edges of the box or the puzzle pieces. You know, you're a kid, you dump out all the puzzles, get the edge pieces.
Yeah.
I think we're looking at the edge pieces in relationship to this issue that can actually hold a metaphysical, ontological, meta-theoretical structure that is actually up to the task of doing that and do it in a way that is pretty revolutionary. So
yeah, I would agree. I think there are good reasons to be optimistic for being able to make a plausible account for.
Well, I'm dispositionally grandiose, John. So people should take that with that backdrop.
I think we can really improve on the morass that the Enlightenment put us in, and I definitely think we can deal. I think we have answers that should be taken seriously to the problem of psychology, to the reconstruction of our ontology, the reciprocal reconstruction, and I think to the chicken and egg problem of the self in the world. I do think that is very much. Why I say that is, to my mind, I think Gary would agree with me. These are central questions within 4E cognitive science. This is not something that's just being done, by sort of fringe intellectuals or something like that. These are the key issues, and I think a very reasonable appraisal of not only my project and Gregg's project, but everybody engaged in that project is we're making really good progress, and we're saying things and disclosing things that were not possibly said or disclosed before. And so for me, I'm optimistic in that way.
Lovely. All right,
Gary,
so we'll pick up this conversation.
Yeah.
Gary, you want to summarize, and we'll head on out.
Anything you want to say, Gary?
Hey, yeah. I mean, last time I threw this question in, like, where is normativity? Where do we find it? I guess now I'm what's the question I'm left with? I suppose we took a detour from the original question, which was about problematizing and setting up the parameters around the question of normativity. And we went into the historical, philosophical, theoretical questions about what happened to our worldview at the level of ontology back during the Enlightenment that led to this rupturing that we, now looking back at it in hindsight, that's what the first episode was sort of pointing out, all the different problems that we now face, right, when trying to understand normativity, psychological normativity. And so I guess we could link this episode with that one together in the following way that, right, we sort of went backwards today. This was part of the philosophical historical backdrop of why those problems, the problem of equivocation, et cetera, are now there. And so the questions that I'm seeing now are, in order to work our way through to solving the puzzle of normativity, we have to spend some time discussing the ontological and epistemological issues that we started discussing today and fleshing out. And what I also see as important is phenomenology, a sort of non-reductionist stance, whereby you reject all three positions of dualism, idealism, physicalism, but look for some sort of other way. And that's where transjectivity comes in as that plausible or tenable other way. and then to keep following that path to see where it takes us with respect to the problem of normativity. And one more point, instead of, maybe this is like a kind of Heideggerian point to make, but when we think about normativity, we think about a thing, or maybe there's that sort of implicit prejudice there that we're trying to locate something that's static, something that is definite or definitive. But maybe that's a wrong way of looking at it. And maybe, and I'm literally drawing from my experience in clinical practice so far, that the normativity that I've been in touch with, I've connected to by way of a certain kind of process or certain sets of processes. And so thinking about what it might be like to think of normativity as a process rather than as a kind of product, what might that do to our conceptions of it or our intuitions about it? That's all I'll say.
Super.
Yeah, that's Plato's problem, right? Plato's problem is normativity has to be beyond us, so we don't properly know it. But if it's not within us at all, then we can't possibly be touched or called by it. So somehow it's in us and beyond us. And I think that is something that I'm
Can it exist in a transective space, John?
Yeah, yeah, exactly. And that there's something inherently aspirational about both normativity and reason. This is where my thinking is right now. So I would very much like to go to that topic. Yes.
Okay.
So I'm gonna draw this to a close.
Yep.
This has been amazing. We're already really digging deep, and I suspect we will dig deeper and into richer ore. So thank you very much, my friends.
All right. Take care.